Karl Marx is one of the most celebrated scholars of his time, and in sociology, he's cited as one of the founding fathers of sociology. Others being Imre Durkheim, Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, and Max Weber. Today, we want to look at Karl Marx with regard to his sociological thoughts. What was his stand about certain things that occurred in society? And therefore, these thoughts form the basis upon which his contribution to the development and growth of the discipline of sociology is evaluated. So we want us to look at Karl Marx. One of his most famous quotation is that it is not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. Quite a very, very powerful quotation or thought. We want to begin by looking at briefly the educational background of Karl Marx. What is available puts his education from secondary school all the way to a PhD level. And available records indicate that Marx joined a school known as Trier in Prussia. Prussia is currently part of formerly, but currently part of the Greater Republic of Germany today. Between 1830 to 1835, where he studied classics, humanities, and languages. These were the areas that he focused on at high school. Later on, he enrolled at the University of Bonn to study law. Records indicate that law was not his preferred choice of training, but rather it is his father who forced him into enrolling for law. And therefore, it is said that he enrolled for law to please the father's wishes. Otherwise, his main area was philosophy. And that is why later on, he joined the University of Berlin to study philosophy. He later on enrolled at the University of Jena in 1841, rather much earlier, and in 1841, he graduated with a PhD, focusing or specializing in the Greek philosophy. What are some of the thoughts or sociological thoughts that Karl Marx is remembered for, and which formed part of the building blocks of the discipline of sociology? But before we go there, we want to understand some of the people that influenced the sociological thinking or the philosophical thinking that formed Karl Marx. One of them is Hegel, and Marx, in his writings, adopted the dialectical method of reasoning that's formulated by Hegel. And in that one, he called it historical materialism. Another important scholar of the time that also influenced Marx's philosophical thoughts was Ludwig Feuerbach. And Feuerbach influenced Marx, and through his influence, he broke away from Hegel's understanding of what religion was, and he, through that, now wanted to understand about humanity, the way people do things, the material world. Then the other group of young scholars, which included Marx, was a group of young scholars called the Young Hegelians. These were a group of radical thinkers that included Bruno Buer and Max Steiner, and they used Hegelian critique to question traditional religion and the Prussian state. They want to understand the role of religion and whether people who preach religion were actually living according to the religious doctrines. So they used the understanding of Hegelian work to criticize or to evaluate traditional religion and the activities of the Prussian state at that time. Then the other important people, scholars, that also influenced Karl Marx thinking were Adam Smith and David Ricardo. These were classical British economists, and therefore much of his contributions on economics, or what we call economic determinism, are largely anchored on the ideas of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The other important people that also influenced Marx thinking were French socialists or French scholars. Among them were Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings were widely acclaimed and also contributed to the understanding of the modern state. The other important scholar was Henry de Saint-Simon and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. All these guys introduced Marx to critiques of private property and visions of egalitarian reform. These were some of the key guys that helped shape Marx thinking, although there are others, but these are the most important and critical scholars that Marx relied on ideas to help shape his thinking. Uh, what was Marx's understanding of societal development? In other words, how do societies develop? This was a critical area. So we want to look at Marx's sociological thoughts on societal development. According to Marx, material and economic conditions that people face or that people find themselves are the primary drivers of societal development. In other words, we look at our material and economic situations, and that is what triggers us to engage in activities that push us to a better level of life. And they identified 5 stages that societies go through in their attempt to overcome challenges that they face from each stage. These stages, he described them as 1, primitive communism; number 2, slavery; number 3, feudalism; number 4, capitalism; and then the 5th one, socialism. Let's try to understand what each stage looked like. In primitive communalism, according to Marx, the main mode of production was hunting and gathering. But even as people hunted and gathered for survival, the kind of products or results of production was largely subsistence. In other words, there was no surplus to exchange for cash or for goods and services through barter trade. Again, a society of that time was characterized by equality. In other words, it was classless. We did not have class division where we have the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. No, the entire everybody else were equal in terms of wealth. That's why he talked of equality. Again, there was a division of labor, but that division of labor was based on age. The age of people was a division of labor. In other words, there were activities to be carried out by young people, others by young adults, and others by the elderly. So it was purely division of labor. The other important stage is the slavery, or what we call the slave society. This slave society was characterized by surplus production. Society now had moved from subsistence production to surplus production. In other words, there was more that was produced beyond the consumption of households. Therefore, such goods could be exchanged for other goods or services. Another important characteristic here is that there was private ownership of property. Remember, at primitive stage, people did not own property. Whatever that was available was collectively owned. It was collectively owned, not owned by individual, and that's why we did not. It was a classless society. Then the other important feature of the slave society was forced labor, because people were captured by force. through conquest, and then they are put to work in people's farms for purpose of production. They could be paid or not paid at all. They had no right to uh, to reward for their labor. Again, this society was also highly characterized by exploitation because slaves could work without due regard to their welfare, and therefore they were completely exploited. We then moved to a stage that we call the feudalism. Feudalism was largely an agricultural based society. There was also rigid hierarchy of land ownership. In other words, we had people that owned large tracts of land against others that owned nearly nothing. And therefore, uh, that hierarchy was quite blaring. And this is the time that we had those who owned large tracts of land being referred to as the landlords. They were lords of land because the amount of land they owned was quite unimaginable, only similar to what the Lord God actually owned. Any other person who wanted to use land had to uh, lease from them so that they become tenants. And therefore, labor, there was also labor extraction from serfs or peasants. This is why I was saying that if you wanted land, you could be given a small piece of land in exchange for your labor in the large farms that were owned by the feudals. The other important stage after feudalism was capitalism. Capitalism, according to Marx, was characterized by industrialization, private property ownership, as well as wage labor. So at this stage now, people started to exchange their labor for cash. Then the last stage, which according to Marx, we are yet to be there, is socialism or communism. This is a classless society where property and means of production are collectively owned by everyone and where there is no exploitation of individuals. In other words, it would be the modern version of the first stage of human development, which was the primitive communism. Another important stage, another important thought that Karl Marx offered was his understanding of social change. How does change come in society? How does a society progress from one stage to another? When we look at the other one, he gave his idea in terms of the various stages that society has gone through or is going through until it reached the ideal stage. But at this other stage now, in his views, a social change now implies that he's now trying to account on how individuals or societies move from one stage of development to another. What is the means? What is the means of the movement from a lower stage to a higher stage? And by social change, we mean the process of alteration of various structures existing within a particular society. It should be understood that whatever that we find in life are largely characterized by the social structures. It is the social structure that sustain us. These structures might be working to satisfy our needs, or some might not be working. If they're not working, then they are changed and they're replaced by better ones that can work to serve societal needs. And social change, according to Marx, is a normal and essential phenomena to society. In other words, it is important for a society to undergo social change, and society needs to understand change as a necessary and a normal process because it is through social change that society progresses. Again, according to Marx, change is brought about by the struggle for limited power and resources in society. In other words, the most essential means under which change occurs in society is the struggle. Why do we have the struggle? We have the struggle because the power and resources that exist in society is not sufficient for everyone. Because they're not sufficient for everyone, people, groups, classes, institutions, individuals, among others, struggle to get part of it. And it is this struggle that results in change, because those who have better mechanism of struggling, or individuals will devise better mechanisms, will innovate better ways of ensuring that their participation in the struggle wins them greater favor than their competitor. And this is now what creates what? Change, innovation, and even invention. So it is through the struggle that change is brought up or is brought about in society. And therefore, the struggle for limited resources and power occurs between individuals, between classes, between groups, and also between institutions. To him, therefore, it is competition over resources rather than consensus that is a characteristic of human relationships. In other words, people don't always agree. Most of the times, people compete, people disagree, people conflict, and this is the main feature of the human society. This is unlike the proposition by others who say that the relationship between people is through consensus. But Marx is saying that the relationship between people is through conflict, struggles, and competition. This is because those who have resources fight as much as they can to maintain and retain those resources, while those who do not have resources are also fighting tooth and nail to acquire resources that they do not have. This is what brings competition, this is what brings struggle, and this is what leads to social change. What was Marx, or what is Marx's understanding of the structure of society? How is society structured according to Marx? Now, Marx conceives society as divided into two broad groups. In other words, when you take any society, you can divide it into two broad groups. We have a group that he described as the wealthy or the haves, and the group that he describes as the poor or the have-nots. He uses the term bourgeoisie to describe the group that is wealthy, and the term proletariat to describe the group that is poor. And therefore, the term bourgeoisie is used to represent the wealthy and the most powerful in society. Those who are wealthy and powerful often use all available means at their disposal, including initiating violence to retain their status. In other words, they want to retain their status at all cost, using both friendly and unfriendly means, using both peaceful and violent means. While the proletariat, those who do not have the resources at the moment, and whom we call the working class, the lower class, or the poor, are always oppressed by the bourgeoisie. So it is this relationship of exploitation and oppression that characterizes the structure of society. One dominates, the other one is dominated. Marx therefore maintains that social institutions that exist in our societies, education, family, the state, economy, and religion, are used by the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, to perpetuate their interests at the expense of the interest of the wider members of society. And therefore, these institutions are not signs of progress, but rather tools that the wealthy utilize to marginalize the poor. In short, any society, according to Karl Marx, is divided into two: the wealthy, whom he calls the bourgeoisie, and the poor, whom he calls the proletariat, so that you are either a bourgeoisie or a proletariat at any one time. There is no there is no a middle ground when it comes to the structure of society. Marx also had expressed certain views about religion. And one of his understanding of religion is that a religion is an institution that should teach morality, values, and beliefs. According to him, those should be the purposes of religion. But then, having observed religious practices across Germany and also his entire life, he concluded that religion as an institution was not performing its rightful purpose. Instead, it was more focused on masking the truth and misguiding their followers. They do so by promising them false hope and engaging in practices that amounts to him superstition. According to Marx, therefore, religion is not engaging in teaching morality, in implanting values and beliefs for which it is meant to do, but instead engaging activities that are meant to blind people from the realities of life. And so, according to him, the ruling class used religion to provide false hope and comfort to the poor while exploiting them. And therefore, Marx believed that religion is an opiate. In other words, it gave a sense of security and salvation of something yet to come. It provides people with false hope, false belief, right? So he had a fairly very bad attitude or quite unkind to what religion is. How is order maintained in society? This was also his thought. And according to him, while it is important for society to have order, he believes that the beneficiary of this order is the rich, not the poor. And therefore, he holds that individual groups within society work to try to maximize their own wealth and power. And they use the calmness of order. They hide under social order to pursue wealth and power. He also contends that social order is maintained by domination and power rather than by consensus and conformity. According to him, what people see as an agreement with the rules and regulations that govern society is actually not an agreement per se. It's not a consensus, but rather people submit to authority because they are dominated by those in power and those who own the greatest wealth, so that those in control of a disproportionate share of society's resources employ all means, including violence, intimidation, and also the creation of laws to defend and protect their status and advantages in society. So that whichever way you look at it, order is not a product of human will, but one that is forced on people by the powerful. Uh, Marx' sociological thoughts have been criticized, and therefore I want us to look at some of the criticisms that have been leveled against Marx' sociological thoughts. One of them is that Marx fails to appreciate what others call as intergroup benefits. And according to critics, it's not always that groups fight or groups compete. Sometimes groups can come together to pursue things that benefit them, not necessarily those that separate them. And for example, the relationship between groups as one of competition over resources and power is not always the same. In some cases, different groups often work together for common goals, so that even when there is competition, when there is struggle, it is not always that everything groups achieve through struggle. Sometimes groups can come together to achieve things that are of mutual benefit. Uh, Marx is also criticized for observing that institutional arrangements that allow reciprocal exchanges between and among groups, uh, he did not capture those as important elements to suggest that groups are not always in competition or in conflict with each other. So according to him, therefore, according to critics, therefore, there are reciprocal exchanges that exist between groups. And these have ensured that groups exist in harmony, not always in conflict. The other one is the promotion of anarchy. Others feel that insisting that all the time people need to compete, people need to be in conflict. Others accuse him of appearing to promote anarchy, and therefore it is not always that uh, things can only come through strifes. There are also a lot of things that they think can come through consensus and through peaceful means. And they have cited several changes in many countries. Countries have come up with better constitutions, better economic models. They've addressed better so many human problems without through competition. Therefore, social change is not always just a product of violence or conflict or competition, the way Marx is trying to portray it. And therefore, he has been his emphasis on conflict, on violence as a means of social change has been interpreted by others as an attempt to promote anarchy in society. Uh, it's also believed that Marx appeared to oversimplify social change, and critics observe that change is a very complex phenomenon, uh, and you cannot reduce it merely to issues of power and class struggle. And they observe that change is a complex phenomenon which is influenced by multiple factors, including culture, including history, individual agencies, and cooperation. So it's not just one factor between person A and person B or group A and group B. There are factors that are also external to these groups, but still determine the direction and the effectiveness of change. So, appearing to reduce change to a matter of power and class struggle is seen by critics as a serious simplification of what social change is. He has failed to appreciate the complex nature of change, the fact that even those who are willing to change, sometimes other external factors come in and interfere with the change that they want to pursue. Uh, Again, Marx has also been criticized for failing to provide solutions to some of the problems that he has highlighted in his sociological thoughts. And people tend to think that uh, while it is important to identify problems that exist in society, it is equally important to prescribe or to suggest solutions to those problems. So that when we talk about inequality, when we talk about poverty, when we talk about marginalization, there is also need for those who identify these issues as problems in society. There's also need for them to identify ways and means of resolving these problems. I think up to that point, I want us to stop, and I want us this debate about Karl Marx's contribution to the development of sociology to continue. Let this just be the beginning. of that discussion. Thank you so much for listening to me and for your time. Thank you.